Hi, I'm Jordan Max, President of Upstream Management Solutions, and welcome to today's executive briefing. Today, we're going to explore a simple question: why strategic plans fail to adapt and what to do about it. More specifically, how well are regulators positioned to respond to change while a plan is already in motion. Organizations don't fail because they lack plans. They fail because they cannot adapt those plans when conditions change. The question for regulators is not whether change will happen, it's whether we will recognize it early enough and be able to respond to it fast enough. Because while the mandate is stable, the environment around it is not. At Upstream Management Solutions, we support professional regulators primarily in Ontario across strategy and strategic agility, policy and regulatory frameworks, and performance and transparency. We speak regulator because we're grounded in governance, operating realities, and public interest decision-making, with 20 plus years of work inside Ontario's profession regulatory system. What I'm about to share with you is based on direct observation across Ontario regulators, the patterns emerging across strategy, governance, and performance, and the consistent challenges that we see where regulators attempt to adapt their plans cycle. This is not theoretical, it reflects how regulators are actually operating today. Typically, you have a mandate within your legislation that gives you a phrase like, we regulate the practice of X in the public interest. While that phrase is static, everything else about it is changing. The aspects of regulation, what kinds of tools do you need to be able to regulate effectively? What's changing in practice? What kind of risks are being generated or mitigated? And where are they coming from? Typically business and other social sources. And changes in public interest and expectations. So then the question becomes, how positioned and capable are we to identify, assess, and respond to those changes in a timely manner so that we may retain our relevancy as regulators? The natural tension between planning and adapting. Too rigid and you can't respond. Too reactive and you lose direction. The real challenge is, can we do both at the same time? What we're seeing across some regulators is not a lack of planning, it's a lack of adaptability alongside it. Between planning and crisis management is where strategic agility lies. During COVID, regulators didn't go back to their strategic plans to decide what to do. They had to interpret incomplete information, make decisions quickly, and adjust as those conditions changed. That was forced agility. The question now is, do those same capabilities exist even when we're not in crisis? Your typical strategic plan follows a 5-year cycle, maybe 3 years in some instances. There are fixed priorities and periodic reporting, but it assumes that you have a stable environment behind it. But today, instead, what we're seeing is rapid technological change, especially with AI, rising public expectations, and increased oversight and scrutiny from both public and private concerns. So the pace of change is now outstripping the plans that we have. The more likely scenario of when strategic plans fail to adapt happens mid-cycle. You can have government policy or legislative changes. You can have internal financial pressures that may be short-term or even longer term. You may have council, board, or leadership turnovers that change priorities. Or you might have multi-year projects that stall or get distracted one way or the other. And of course, crises can happen at any time. Best example, perhaps, COVID-19, but it can also include budget deficits or something more catastrophic, fire, data loss, data breach, systems failures, etc. What happens in these situations? The organization identifies it, deals with it, but then, unfortunately, it goes back to normal. Now let's explore why those strategies fail to adapt. We can pin it down to three basic reasons. Firstly, the strategy itself can't change. There are rigid plans with fixed timelines and objectives, and there aren't any built-in mechanisms to adjust mid-course. Secondly, decisions can take too long. There are layered approvals, there might be unclear priorities, and if you have slow processes, that can delay timely responses to those decisions. Thirdly, the work itself is not easy to shift. That can happen due to operational rigidity, limited capacities, and inflexible resources that make the changes hard to execute. So strategic agility isn't about making plans more flexible. It's about building the capacity in the organization to detect, interpret, decide, and act, and to do all of the above quickly. Strategy itself is not the problem. Most regulators actually have strategic plans, they have reporting frameworks, they have clearly defined priorities, but they don't have the mechanisms to adapt mid-cycle. They don't have fast decision-making pathways, and they don't have the ability to shift the work in practice. This is where there's a gap between planning and adaptability. When we've done some work on looking at regulators and how they report and how they identify agility, we can see that there is moderate agility. There's some awareness of change, but reporting is often inconsistent, it's not structured, and it's not clearly linked to decisions. So organizations are tracking progress, but not consistently using it to adapt. If we envision strategic maturity as a pyramid, we could see that most regulators sit in the middle. They have strong planning, they have some reporting, but limited adaptability, and very few operate at the top level with continuous strategic adjustment to truly be agile. One way to do a quick check on your organization and strategic adaptability is to ask yourself these 5 questions. Do we have defined points for review or adjustment? Are there clear triggers for reassessing priorities? Do we have regular strategy discussions that can include possible changes needing to be made? Can we shift priorities without having a full plan reset? And do we use our data to adjust strategy, not just to report on it? You can do that kind of self-assessment, give yourself a score of 1 for yes and 0 for no, and you'll get a quick read on some of that. So what we often see is that regulators have dashboards, KPIs, their CEOs and registrars provide updates to the boards and councils and their environmental scans done. What's missing are the decisions that need to be made around reprioritizing aspects and resources. Be able to reset strategy and for the board to lead those discussions and actions around course correction. Strategic agility is not a concept that operates as a system. You need the ability to sense, decide, act, and learn. If any one of those breaks, the system breaks. We see that organizations can sense change, but decision-making might be slow, or decisions are made, but operationally nothing shifts, or the actions are taken, but there's no learning loop. So the issue isn't whether the organization is aware, it's whether the system actually functions holistically and end-to-end. Strong regulators consistently anticipate, adjust, test, and learn, and they build this into how they operate, not just into a strategic plan. Most organizations don't need a new strategy. They need the ability to adapt the one they have. And in the regulatory context, that's not just an operational issue, it directly affects how effectively you protect the public. One way to do this in a more structured way is to use something we've developed called the Strategic Agility Diagnostic Index, or SADI. It's designed to assess the three core failure points we've seen across regulators in strategy, decision-making, and execution. It uses 5 different dimensions with 23 evidence-based criteria and scoring. The goal is to identify where adaptation is breaking down and what we can do about it. A little bit more about these 5 dimensions. The first is environmental intelligence, how to anticipate, find, and share changes happening. Strategic responsiveness, how to interpret and decide on the actions we need to take. Governance agility, how to delegate and to be able to make decisions quickly. Operational flexibility, how to innovate, reprioritize, test, and launch solutions. And finally, learning and adaptation, how to retain those lessons learned and to reinforce an agility mindset throughout the organization. That has to do with culture, it has to do with structures as well within the organization and how fluid they are. Organizations typically would start with a diagnostic, a leadership discussion, or targeted capacity building. If this is the current or emerging priority for you, I'd be glad to meet with you and compare notes. And thank you very much for your time and interest. And let's talk.